All right. So we're going to start on this cold, frosty evening with the opening prayer that's on page 29 in the workbook here. So I'm going to mute everybody just so we don't get too much feedback. Good evening. We'll let you get settled.
No, thanks.
This thing too, I have no idea if that shows up on the recording or not, so. So as we get ready, we'll page 29. Das ist aber 29. Die Zeitung, no, 29. Okay. Dear Savior and Redeemer, you are the God of creation and the Lord of time and eternity. Grant us the help of your Holy Spirit to see the difference between the kingdoms we fallen humans strive to build and the kingdom that you establish through your life, death, and resurrection. Open our eyes to see that your kingdom is not like those of this world. You sought no palace, no wealth, no expensive robes. You touched those considered untouchable. You ate with those seen as nobodies. You washed people's feet. You served without limit. Your throne was a cross. Grant us joy in feeling your forgiving touch. Empower us to walk out of step with this world and with peace in our hearts as we look forward to the world to come. In your precious name, we pray and give thanks. Amen. Okay. So we're going to do a review of the session last time. So if you want to open up to page 90, we only had 2 illustrations. Would somebody please read 8A?
The first 7 chapters in 1 Samuel reveal that corruption was rampant among some of Israel's religious leaders. The sons of the priest Eli exploited the people and lived immoral lives. Samuel's sons sought bribes and perverted justice. 1 Samuel chapters 8 through 11 deal with the issue. Should the Israelites appoint a kings? Yes or no? In the debate described in these chapters, the writer refers to the prospective ruler as both prince and king. The term prince always has positive overtones. The term king sometimes has positive overtones, sometimes negative overtones. After all, God is really Israel's king. Israel's first king was Saul, a Benjaminite. After his death in battle, Saul was replaced by David of Judah.
All right. So again, this picture tries to capture that broad swath of activity taking place. You see the Ark of the Covenant sort of here in the center, and then a dot at Shiloh, and then it sort of goes on tour, so to speak. Remember, it got captured by the Philistines, and they moved it from place to place and finally sent it back. And then over here to the left is an attempt to kind of put a ballot box. Should we have a king? Yes or no? Because at that closing sentence in Judges was there was no king in Israel in those days. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And you get this sense that there's this tension, and is having a king going to be a good thing, a helpful thing, or not? And we saw as we journeyed through, it's a little bit of a mixed bag, but they start off with King Saul, and then 8B takes us to David, if someone wants to read that.
Although David first ruled only the territory occupied by Judah, his own tribe, he eventually gained control of all Israel and then subdued and annexed surrounding nations. In 2 Samuel chapter 7, we read that God promised David that his dynasty would be a continuing one. Although David's reign was a brutal affair, those who preserved its memory idolized David. After all, he united the realm, expanded its borders, captured Jerusalem, and installed the Ark of the Covenant within its walls, establishing a continuing dynasty and worshiped one God in one city.
And so with David, we run into both someone who expands the realm, and you can see the yellow on the picture is as large of a territory as the kingdom ever became. And we'll see later on how that plays into the memories and the hopes and dreams of the people. This little pink section down here is where David started. This was the territory held by the tribe of Judah. Eventually, after several years, the rest of the tribes agreed to have him be their leader. And then these arrows with the little explosions at the end are battles he had against neighbors, subduing all of them, never totally annexing where the Philistines are, and but controlling a lot of territory. And I think somebody mentioned, they said, hey, I've seen that little white strip in the map of things going on in the world today. And some of these battles are still occurring in many ways. And then down over here in this corner were the after David got to be king, we read about how when the kings go out to war, David didn't go out to war, stayed home in Jerusalem, and instead forced himself upon Bathsheba, and everything kind of broke apart at that point. And so several of his children were killed. And that tied in with that passage from Exodus about how if you steal someone's sheep, you got to pay fourfold back. And yet, in 2 Samuel 7, we saw the promise God made to David. While David wanted to build God a house, God said, no, I'm happy not being in a house in the temple. I will build a house out of you, hence this line of kings. And then spent a little bit of time in this bottom right corner talking about how could David be considered a man after God's own heart when he lived a life that wasn't necessarily virtuous at all. And as we'll see more and more in this unit too, that being a man after God's own heart is the writer's way of describing that David worshiped one God in one place, Jerusalem. And that whole sense of worshiping God only in Jerusalem is going to play a big role into whether subsequent kings are considered good kings or not good kings. And so it's a complex kind of dialogue. And the other thing to hang on to, and I don't know if I mentioned this last time, when we get to our final unit in the Old Testament before we jump ahead into the New, we'll do a little quick look at Chronicles. And Chronicles is a retelling of their history, and you're going to see it gets scrubbed pretty clean. And so most of the Sunday school lessons that we probably grew up with, I know certainly me, guessing also for you, those are more of the chronicler's David and not the David that we read about in Samuel and Kings. On the flip side, it's actually sort of weird to say it this way, but it's actually a good thing that we get the honest portrayal in the Bible, right? Because it reminds us then that the Bible isn't a scrubbed book trying to make everything look polished and clean, because ultimately the only hero in the narrative is God. So, any questions on the journey with going from no kings to kings? All right, in the unit that we will cover tonight, we're going the other direction. But first, we'll start with Solomon. After David dies, there's a little bit of a battle for the throne. We looked at that. Open up, if you will, into 1 Kings chapter 1. I will sometimes talk about the subtitles with favor and other times not with favor. The subtitles that you have in your Bibles are not the Bible, right? They're added in by the editors of that particular version of the Bible, most of the time designed to help us. Sometimes they can sort of give us the wrong or not give us the right information. For example, if you look at Exodus chapter 20, chances are the subtitle says the 10 Commandments. Well, the 10 Commandments are actually part of the covenant at Sinai. And so it's more than just the 10 Commandments. But my subtitle here says at 1 Kings 1, the struggle for succession. Do you have something similar?
Same thing.
Same thing? Okay, what does yours say? Okay, Adonijah sets himself up as king. That's one of David's sons. Okay, what else do people have?
Above that, mine says
Solomon becomes king. Okay, is it going to be Adonijah? Is it going to be Solomon? Right? And here's where the story goes. I'll read. 1 Kings 1. King David was old and advanced in years, and although they covered him with clothes, he could not get warm. So poor circulation, right? Old age, whatever it might be. So his servants said, let a young virgin be sought for my lord the king, and let her wait on the king and be his attendant. Let her lie in your bosom so that my lord the king may be warm. What's their solution? They don't have electric blankets. So they go find some beautiful young woman who's going to help David with his hypothermia, right? She's going to snuggle up with him and keep him warm. That's what they do, right? They search for a beautiful girl throughout all the territory. They found Abishag the Shunammite and brought her to the king. The girl was very beautiful. She became his king's attendant and served him. But what? Old King David sleeping next to this young, beautiful, naked woman. They just sleep. And the very next line, what does yours say, Holly? Verse 5?
Now Adonijah's mother was Haggith, put himself forward and said, I will be king.
You see, David is no longer virile, so he's no longer able to be king. And his son Adonijah is going to make a grab for the throne. And we talked a little bit about that. He gathered some people around himself. He decided that he got Joab, who was the general. He got Abiathar, the priest. But he didn't get Zadok, another priest. He didn't get Benaiah, who was the bodyguard, and he didn't the head of the bodyguards, and he didn't get the prophet Nathan and a few others. So Adonijah is going to make himself king, but Bathsheba, Solomon's mom, hears about this. She hustles in and consults with the other side of the political group, if you will, and says, we're in trouble here. Because if Adonijah becomes king, you and your son are gone. And so she conspires is maybe too strong of a word, but there's some intrigue here that she gets together with Nathan, the prophet, and they agree to go in one after another to the aged king and say, hey, I thought you said David or Solomon was going to be king. What's this stuff with Adonijah? And they convince him to do so. He calls for his animal, so Solomon gets to ride his animal, and they coronate Solomon as king. And eventually, if you got a chance to read this, Adonijah will die. Remember why? Yeah, why?
He wanted Abishag.
He wanted that young gal who was sleeping with his dad, but only sleeping with his dad. And so if you, and so this is, again, this is not the pool we usually swim in, right? But to claim the king's harem is to claim kingship. And so that's the move here. And there's it, you know, we're not generally taught about these kinds of things going on in the story, but the same sort of struggle for power that you see happening in the wider world around us, or that you get fascinated with in history books, or you go watch movies or other shows that kind of pick those same sorts of themes, many of those same things are happening here. And so when Adonijah goes to Bathsheba and says, I want you to do me a favor. I want you to ask the king if I can have this woman as my wife. Solomon interprets it as a grab for the throne. Because to claim the king's harem is to claim the kingship. In a, again, not pleasant way, when we saw Absalom's revolt, the first thing he did was, Dad had left a little bit of his harem back in Jerusalem when he fled. He went up and visited each person in the harem. And, you know, visit is a euphemism, right? So this is what's happening. So Solomon eventually becomes king. And what have you and I heard about Solomon? He's wise. Yep. What else have we heard about Solomon? He builds the temple. Absolutely. And let's look a little bit at this. So Solomon becomes king, and that's sort of the transition from Samuel to Kings. And in 1 Kings chapter 2, again, this is not a pleasant reading necessarily, but somebody read verses 1 through 4. 1 Kings 2.
When the time drew near for David to die, he gave a charge to Solomon his son. I am about to go the way of all the earth, he said. So be strong, show yourself a man, and observe what the Lord your God requires. Walk in his ways and keep his decrees and commands, his laws and requirements, as written in the law of Moses, so that you may prosper in all you do and wherever you go, and that the Lord may keep his promise to me. If your descendants watch how they live, and if they walk faithfully before me with all their heart and soul, you will never fail to have a man on the throne of Israel.
Okay, sounds pretty good. Now, some of your versions at the end of verse 2 will say, be strong and courageous. Yours said what? Be
Yourself a man.
Be strong, show yourself a man. Do those words sound familiar? Well, when Joshua took over from Moses, that angel appears to him and says, be strong and courageous, right? We had this with some of our confirmation students, chose that verse, be strong and courageous, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. So this is a word that's been passed down in previous narratives that we have been following. And he tells him, right, keep walking in the ways that God commands us, walk in his commandments, walk in his statutes, walk in his ordinances. You might have rules, you might have regulations. You have different words that are in there. Keeping that Sinai covenant, right? So that's been passed through. And even if he repeats in some ways the promise that was spoken to him in verse 4, where God told him, if your heirs take heed to walk before me, there will always be a successor in the throne. That again is this picture here, this line of kings. It's not going to, because Saul was from the tribe of Benjamin. David is from the tribe of Judah. Where's the next king going to come from? The promise was walking in these ways would be a whole series of kings that would come. But there's some other advice that's given. Keep reading.
Now you yourself know that Joab, son of Zeruiah, did to me what he did to the two commanders of Israel's armies, Abner, son of Ner, and Amasa, son of Jether. He killed them, shedding their blood in peacetime, as if in battle, and with that blood stained the belt around his waist and the sandals on his feet. Deal with him according to your wisdom, but do not let his gray head go down to the grave in peace.
Okay. What's he telling him?
Tell Joab.
Yeah. Joab did me wrong. You're a smart guy. you know what to do. I mean, this is, you know, they don't make flannel graphs out of this part of the story. Right? Keep going.
But show kindness to the son of Barzillai, is it?
Barzillai, I don't know.
Barzillai of Gilead, and let them be among those who eat at your table. They stood by me when I fled from your brother Absalom.
Okay, so this guy, wipe out. This guy, he's good. Treat him well. Keep going.
Remember, you have with you Shimei, son of Gera, the Benjamite from Bahurim, who called down bitter curses on me the day I went to Mahanaim.
M.
When he came down to meet me at the Jordan, I swore to him by the Lord, I will not put you to death by the sword, but now do not consider him innocent. You are a man of wisdom. You will know what to do to him. Bring his gray head down to the grave in blood.
Okay. So he says, I promised I wouldn't kill him, but you're not me. This is tough stuff. Finish 10 through 12.
But David rested with his fathers and was buried in the city of David. He had reigned 40 years over Israel, 7 years in Hebron, and 33 years in Jerusalem. So Solomon sat on the throne of his father David, and his rule was firmly established.
His rule was firmly established. What's that sound like?
Got rid of the opposition.
Well, yeah, well, it hasn't happened yet, but everything's settled. Solomon's the king. And then we read, and I referenced this already. What comes next? Adonijah comes and maybe makes a grab for the throne, but anyway, it's not good. And so he is, he's killed, right? Abiathar the priest, who was the priest who supported Adonijah, when he thought, I'm going to be next in line, he gets banished and sent back to his home area, which is in Anatote. When Joab, this is verse 28 of chapter 2, when Joab hears news of this, you know, when his Facebook feed gives him this information and he's up to date on the news, what's he do? He knows he's in trouble, right? I mean, it doesn't take a genius to figure some of these things out. He goes, grabs the horns of the altar, which is supposed to be a safe place, and they tell him, come on out, you know it's done for. He says, no, I'm gonna die here. So he does. I mean, it's nasty, bloody stuff. Then the last person that gets talked about here is the Shimei guy, the guy who was cursing David. And the king makes an agreement with him that he's to build a house in Jerusalem. This is verse 36. He's supposed to live there. Don't leave the county line, right? Don't leave the city. If you go across the Wadi Kidron, the Kidron Valley, then that's it. And that he says that sounds fair. So, right, so he's allowed to live in Jerusalem, but it says 3 years later, 2 of his slaves ran away. He hears about it. He goes to get him. He brings it back. And so he broke the rule. He's killed. And now the closing line of chapter 2 says,
Then the king gave the order to Benaiah son of Jehoiada, and he went out and struck Shimei down and killed him. The kingdom was now firmly established in Solomon's.
now, right? I mean, this is bloody stuff. But now a chapter that at least gives us some comfort and consolation. It's not all bad. Somebody begin reading chapter 3 of First Kings.
Solomon made an alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and married his daughter. He brought her to the city of David until he finished building his palace in the temple of the Lord and the wall around Jerusalem. The people, however, were still sacrificing at the high places because the temple had not yet been built for the name of the Lord.
Okay, what do you hear in those couple of verses? We're told about a marriage alliance between whom? Solomon and Pharaoh. Okay? And what's the alliance? He marries his daughter. So in ancient times, and perhaps still a little bit, I mean, one of the ways that powerful factions make alliances is through marriage. If you marry my daughter and your son and my daughter have grandchildren, I'm less likely to want to come and attack you because I've got a stake in your household. Make sense? And of course, if you got a chance, depending on how much you got a chance to read, how many wives will Solomon have?
Many.
700, right? 700 wives and 300 concubines. It's just
I bet you he didn't know all their names.
probably not, right? But a lot of those would be alliances made in different sorts of things. We're not given nearly the detail, and it's interestingly enough, the writer, the Kings, never makes really any comment except to throw the number out. I mean, most people today, when they hear that, just go, "God, this is crazy." But it is how life was done. But what's the other thing that is hinted at in these verses 1 and 2, besides the alliance? It's in verse 2.
The sacrificing at the high places.
The sacrificing at the high places.
Not in Jerusalem.
Not in Jerusalem. How come?
There wasn't a temple.
There wasn't a temple in Jerusalem yet. So the writer here is giving you a little hint about his bias, right? That they should not be having sacrifices in these other places. But there was no temple yet. But that sense of they were still doing that, however, is not a good thing. So let's keep going, because Solomon's going to go to one of those high places. So keep reading verses 3 through 9.
Solomon showed his love for the Lord by walking according to the statutes of his father David, except that he offered sacrifices and burned incense on the high places.
You hear that? Except or only, right? Yeah, he wants to make him good, but there's some trouble here. Keep going.
The king went to Gibeon to offer sacrifice, for that was the most important high place. And Solomon burnt 1,000 burnt offerings on them. At Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon during the night in a dream, and God said, "Ask for whatever you want me to give you." Solomon answered, "You have shown great kindness to your servant, my father David, because he was faithful to you and righteous and upright in heart. You have continued this great kindness to him and have given him a son to sit on his throne this very day. Now, O Lord, my God, you have made your servant king in place of my father David, but I am only a little child and do not know how to carry out my duties. Your servant is here among the people you have chosen, a great people, too numerous to count or number. So give your servant a discerning heart to govern your people and to distinguish between right and wrong. For who is able to govern this great people of yours?"
Okay, take a breath, because here's a good section to read, right? God appears to him and says, "What do you want?" His answer?
Wisdom.
Wisdom. Why? Because I want to rule well. Uh-oh, something's crashing someplace. So this is good, right? So it's not all bad. And keep reading through verse 14.
The Lord was pleased that Solomon had asked for this. So God said to him, "Since you have asked for this and not for long life or wealth for yourself, nor have asked for the death of your enemies, but for discernment in administering justice, I will do what you have asked. I will give you a wise and discerning heart so that there will never have been anyone like you, nor will there ever be. Moreover, I will give you what you have not asked for, both riches and honor, so that in your lifetime you will have no equal among kings. And if you walk in my ways and obey my statutes and commands as David your father did, I will give you a long life."
So how did God feel about his request? This is good, right? And so he's going to give him wisdom. He's going to be wiser than all his peers. And then did you see the if in verse 14? Right? If. So it doesn't give him, he doesn't have the green light to do whatever he wants. He's called still to walk in according with the statutes and commandments, the rules, the ordinances. And then look at what happens in verse 15, John.
Then Solomon awoke and he realized it had been a dream. He returned to Jerusalem, stood before the ark of the Lord's covenant, and sacrificed burnt offerings and fellowship offerings. Then he gave a feast for all his court.
So what's the first thing the wise king did?
Returned to Jerusalem.
And offered sacrifices. Hear the sense? And we're going to see this centralization there. And then probably a story, you know, well, right? This somebody who'd like to read. Go ahead.
Now, two prostitutes came to the king and stood before him. One of them said, "My lord, this woman and I live in the same house. I had a baby while she was there with me. The third day after my child was born, this woman also had a baby. We were alone. There was no one in the house but the two of us. During the night, this woman's son died because she lay on him. So she got up in the middle of the night and took my son from my side while I, your servant, was asleep. She put him by her breast and put her dead son by my breast. The next morning, I got up to nurse my son, and he was dead. But when I looked at him closely in the morning light, I saw that it wasn't the son I had born." The other woman said, "No, the living one is my son, the dead one is yours." But the first one insisted, "No, the dead one is yours, the living one is mine." And so they argued before the king. The king said, "This one says, my son is alive and your son is dead, while that one says, no, your son is dead and mine is alive." Then the king said, "Bring me a sword." So they brought a sword for the king. He then gave an order, "Cut the living child in two and give half to one and half to the other." The woman whose son was alive was filled with compassion for her son and said to the king, "Please, my lord, give her the living baby, don't kill him." But the other said, "Neither I nor you shall have him, cut him in two." Then the king gave his ruling, "Give the living baby to the first woman, do not kill him, she is his mother." When all Israel heard the verdict the king had given, they held the king in awe because they saw that he had wisdom from God to administer justice.
Pretty amazing story, isn't it? When I was taught that, did you learn this one in Sunday school? When I was taught this in Sunday school, it was just two women who came, not two prostitutes. They left that part out. So maybe you had similar experiences. Again, love the scriptures. They're not a kid's book. And you really have to whitewash a lot of stuff to try and get that. So anyway, I was thinking of this story because it's like, I know they didn't tell me they were two prostitutes in Sunday school. Because then I would have said, "What's that?" And then I would have gone home and told my mom. And then my mom, anyway, so yeah. I got in trouble once here for we did a unit on compassion international, and we just showed one of the videos, and the video shared that among other things that compassion does, besides allowing kids to go to school and eat and have, you know, health check and stuff, it keeps them from other kinds of lifestyles that tend to be open for children in poverty, including prostitution. And then one of the girls went home and said, "Mom, what's prostitution? We learned about that in Sunday school." And anyway, well, it didn't end well. But what's there? So, well, what happens next? Chapter 4 is Solomon dividing up the territory into administrative districts, right? And we won't spend a lot of time reading that, but I hope you got a chance to see that essentially the people, 1/3 of their time was given over to serving the king. And 2/3 of their time was given to serving themselves. Now, again, not trying to go too far down and open up a rabbit hole or go too far down a rabbit hole, but we don't necessarily do this same thing, but we do it in terms of taxation, right? I mean, so the tax rate is 33.33%. So 1/3 of your livelihood is given over to support the king. And do you remember when the people came to Samuel and said, "Give us a king"? And God said, "You make sure you tell the people what it's going to cost them if they get a king." And many of the things that Samuel warned them about are what are going to take place with Solomon's reign. And we'll find out that as this unfolds, the northern tribes feel like they're having to bear more of the burden than the southern tribe of Judah is. And so we'll kind of see how that happens. But anyway, at the end of chapter 4, verses 29 to the end, somebody read that.
God gave Solomon unusual wisdom and insight, and knowledge too great to be measured. Solomon was wiser than the wise men of the East and the wise men of Egypt. He was the wisest of all men, wiser than Ethan the Israelite, and Heman, Calcol, and Darda, the sons of Mahol. And his fame spread throughout all of the neighboring countries. He composed 3,000 proverbs and more than 1,000 songs. He spoke of trees and plants, from the Lebanon cedars to the hyssop that grows on the walls. He talked about animals, birds, reptiles, and fish. Kings all over the world heard of his wisdom and sent people to listen to him.
Okay. So he's a well-established, respected leader who has apparently quite diverse interests, right? Interests in many different sorts of things. And what happens in chapter 5 is the beginning of the building of the temple. And one of the things you have to kind of scratch your head about is the turnaround. Remember when David wanted to build a temple, God says, "No, David, I'm perfectly content to be in a tent because I can move then from place to place." But Solomon's going to build this temple, and he agrees with King Hiram of Tyre in a neighboring country, the Phoenicians, that he's going to work with them. For example, in verse 7 of chapter 5, Hiram says, "Blessed be the Lord today, who has given to David a wise son to be over this great people." Well, he just got, if you will, a very nice contract that's going to supply a great deal of wealth and value to his own kingdom. And so this temple gets to be constructed, and we read about that in chapter 6. Somebody read chapter 6, verses 1 through 6.
And it came to pass in the 480th year after the children of Israel were come out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month Ziph, which is the 2nd month, that he began to build the house of the Lord. And the house which King Solomon built for the Lord, the length thereof was 80 cubits, and the breadth thereof 20 cubits, and the height thereof 30 cubits. And the porch before the temple of the house, 20 cubits was the length thereof, according to the breadth of the house, and 10 cubits was the breadth thereof before the house. And for the house he made windows of narrow lights, and against the wall of the house he built chambers round about against the walls of the house round about, both of the temple and of the oracle, and he made chambers round about. The nethermost chamber was 5 cubits broad, and the middle was 6 cubits broad, and the third was 7 cubits broad. For without in the wall of the house was made narrow rest round about, that the beams would not be fastened in the walls of the house.
All right, and it goes into other detail that we'll skip over, but you get some significant description. And I imagine anybody who's got sort of building experience or architectural experience can make a heck of a lot more sense out of this than I can, in whichever translation it's about. But as we get to the end of that chapter, read verse 37 to the end.
The fourth year was the foundation of the house of the Lord laid in the month Zip. And in the 11th year, in the month Bul, which is the 8th month, was the house finished throughout all the parts thereof, according to all the fashion of it. So was he 7 years in building it.
So how long did it take him to build the temple? 7 years. It's a pretty big project, right? We were frustrated when it took 7 months to construct. And then the first verse of the very next chapter, okay, keep reading.
But Solomon was building his own house 13 years, and he finished all his house.
So, well, it's still impressive. They spent 7 years on the temple, but he spent 13 years on his own place. And then you begin to hear about all these different palaces and all these different places. And you get a little bit of a hint because we hear about the house he built for his wife from Pharaoh. And by extrapolation, some Bible scholars believe that all these wives that he had each had their own house. So all these royal apartments and royal palaces and things that are there. So let's look briefly at the picture. So Solomon builds the temple. And so here in this section of the Mediterranean, it's all often filled in with other things. You see a very rough sketch of the temple proper, okay? So there would be steps leading up, then you would have this porch, then you would have this area into which only the priests could go. That's called the holy place. And then here, the Holy of Holies, only the high priest could go, and then only once a year to offer a sacrifice and prayers on behalf of the people. And so and it goes into some great detail in the Bible about its length and breadth and all the different things that are a part of it. But and maybe you've got a Bible like I do that shows drawings and artist renderings, and it's really quite fascinating. We don't have a lot of time to go into that, but if you haven't, you ought to just Google it sometime or whatever your favorite search engine is to go and see some of the models that are there for the temple. Please.
Is any of it still standing in Jerusalem?
Well, no, what's left, because Solomon's temple will be destroyed. That's called the first temple. When they return from exile in Babylon, they will build a second temple. And then King Herod, and that's the King Herod we hear about in the Christmas narrative, he will build the third temple. And he gets rid of the second one, builds the third. The only thing left from the third temple, because when the Romans in 70 AD sacked Jerusalem, they literally pushed the rocks of the temple over into the valley. And so the only part left, he had built a platform on which the temple was built. And so if you ever see pictures of the Jewish people up against this high wall, the Wailing Wall is the one edge. That's what's left of Herod's temple. Yep, it's just the side of the foundation upon which it would be built. And again, not going too far down a rabbit hole, but on that Temple Mount, as it's referred to now, there are 2 mosques that have been built. So you could imagine if the Israelis decided we're getting rid of those mosques and we're building another temple. I mean, this would be, yeah, I mean.
So they don't have a temple?
Uh-uh.
Aren't they supposed to?
No, because what will happen after the Romans destroy the temple, the whole sacrificial system that will be following in this part of the narrative goes away. And so what you have then are synagogues, and that's something different we'll get to when we get to the New Testament. But you'll have synagogues, and then of course you'll have all of the practices that occur within the household.
So I thought in Revelation, the temple was supposed to be rebuilt.
There is a vision of a heavenly temple in a new Jerusalem. Yep, we get some of that in Revelation, but there is no temple after
I thought that's
70
where
AD.
the Antichrist comes back into Israel in the new temple. And isn't that part of Revelation?
No, not really. That's part of Left Behind series, which is something
Isn't that
different,
part
but
of, like, some of the prophecies from Daniel?
there is an abomination of desolation that's talked about, and that is, we'll catch up a little bit to that with Antiochus Epiphanes, but that's before the Maccabees and before Herod. So there was, and just to touch on it briefly, without going too far, there was after Alexander the Great died and his empire was chopped up into pieces, one of the eventual successor generals wanted to make the entire region Hellenized. And so that's when they offered a sacrifice of a pig on the altar in Jerusalem. And that led to a huge revolt. And the revolt was successful, and they didn't have enough oil to rededicate the temple, but the little bit of oil they had lasted 8 days. And if you know anything about Hanukkah, that's what Hanukkah celebrates, is the rededication of the temple, and it's celebrated because for those 8 days because of that oil that lasted for 8 days. Anyway, but there's no we'll get to that a little bit in this course. But so this is the first temple that is constructed. Down here in this lower left section, you see what really couldn't happen. Again, this is just an artist depiction, but this is somebody carrying a huge stone on their back. Well, a person wouldn't be able to lift a stone like this. I don't know about you guys. We've got a few stones in our house that we had delivered that are only about this big, and they brought machines to get them in, because you're not going to be able to pick that up. But the idea is that Solomon enslaved is too strong of a word, but there's forced labor. And in some of the passages, the forced labor, it makes it sound like it was only the foreigners who were still hanging around that were forced labor. But later on, when we hear about the northern tribes saying, your father, to Solomon's son, your father made life too hard for us. You got to change this, or we're not gonna follow you. So again, there's some debate about that. But in this lower part of the picture, this sense that the people had 1 month to work for the king and for the king's interests, and they had 2 months to work for themselves. With me so far? So let's look at page 93 in your text. And typically, we're not going to do a lot of this, but somebody go ahead and read the opening paragraph on page 93.
After Bathsheba influenced David to appoint her son Solomon as his successor, Solomon killed his brother Abadonijah. He sent Abiathar, a priest who had supported Abijah's claim to the throne, into exile in Anathoth. Next, Solomon killed Joab, David's general, who also had supported Adonijah. Joab was David's nephew and Solomon's cousin. Finally, Solomon killed Shimei.
Okay, so that we had talked about that, right? And then point 1 mentions that with the help of King Hiram of Tyre, and this is Tyre up here, this white area, so it's not a part of the kingdom that David had established. He builds his temple, 7 years, right? And he had other palaces, other buildings, 13 years. All the way down here, there was, archaeologists have found a copper smelting. And nobody knows for sure, had it been there and been used, and Solomon took it over, or exactly where it came from, but that's happening there. The other thing that Solomon does is he builds fortresses, okay? And so you see a little fortress here by Getzer. Here's a fortress at Megiddo. The Hebrew word for hill is Har Megiddo, or as we know it better, Armageddon. Okay, so that's where it comes. And then you've got one up here at Hatzor. And so Solomon builds fortifications. There's also texts that seem to indicate that Solomon imported horses from Egypt and sold them to neighboring peoples. And so he's conducting all kinds of business. Look at point number 4. Some felt that Solomon said some very good and wonderful things. Let's look at that. I think we read that already. 1 Kings 1:4-25, didn't we? 1 Kings 4:25. No, we skipped that time. We skipped that one. We read about his fame. Somebody read 20-28, 1 Kings 4. Nicole, you got that?
The people of Judah and Israel were as numerous as the sand on the seashore. They ate, they drank, and they were happy. And Solomon ruled over all the kingdom from the river to the land of the Philistines as far as the border of Egypt. These countries brought tribute and were Solomon's subjects all his life. Solomon's daily provisions were 30 cores of fine flour and 60 cores of meal, 10 head of stall-fed cattle, 20 of pasture-fed cattle, and 100 sheep and goats, as well as deer, gazelles, roebucks, and choice fowl. For he ruled over all the kingdoms west of the river from Tipsha to Gaza, and had peace on all sides. During Solomon's lifetime, Judah and Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, lived in safety, each man under his own vine and fig tree. Solomon had 4,000 stalls for chariot horses and 12,000 horses. The district officers, each in his month, supplied provisions for King Solomon and all who came to the king's table. They saw to it that nothing was lacking. They also brought to the proper place their quotas of barley and straw for the chariot horses and the other horses.
Sounds rather happy and prosperous, doesn't it? Okay. Notice that one little phrase at the end of verse 25. Under what?
Oh, vine and fig tree.
I don't know anymore what the term or phrase is. When I was a boy growing up, it was the house with the white picket fence and a 2-car garage, right? I mean, now it's a chicken in every pot. They're sure. So that under their own vine, under their own fig tree, that's the Old Testament biblical way of saying shalom in a kind of practical lived life way. So hang on to that, because the vine and under their own vine, under their own fig tree, that's gonna be a phrase that shows up in lots of places as we go. And again, just giving you a hint, when Jesus meets Nathanael and said, "Here's an Israelite in whom there is no guile." And Nathanael says, "How do you know me?" He says, "I saw you under the fig tree." And he says, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." So that little phrase is there. Point 5 on page 93. Would somebody read that?
Although Kings does not object to Solomon having 1,000 wives and concubines, it objects to the resulting idolatry. God incited the Edomites and Syrians to break away from Solomon's realm because of his idolatry. 1 Kings 11, 1-25, male and female images lower right.
So what happens here is, these symbols for all these women, and it's again these symbols for these fertility gods and goddesses. The problem wasn't that Solomon, and this is something you think, wait a minute. One man, one woman marriage. I was just working out. But the problem isn't that Solomon had multiple wives. The problem is his wives worship foreign gods. And he not only made provision for them to do so, but he himself took part. Open to 1 Kings 11.
So it was acceptable in the Old Testament to have as many wives as he wanted?
It was not the biggest fish to fry. So people in power had multiple
That went
wives.
So, I mean, that went against what God said. So
It's
then did God just pick and choose what he thought was good about people then?
no, that's a good way to we get a partial story. And so it's again, we come to what's a good way to say it? We can't make some of those statements until we get far enough into the New Testament to see the broader framework, if that makes sense. It's never praised. It is tolerated, but it's never
They
praised.
don't fit.
Not all.
What I see is like fathers give their daughters. It's property. It's a sign of wealth. The more wives you can afford to have, the wealthier you are. It's property. It's wealth. They're not wives or people. They're a commodity or a possession is the way I sort of see it.
Sometimes, but what's interesting is you will get in the even in the Old Testament literature, you will have stories of people like Ruth, like Deborah, like Judith is in the Apocryphal, but you'll get these stories of these heroic women, Esther's the most read Hebrew book because of this great queen. So it's a mix. It's not perfect by any means, but it's God working with broken people and through broken people, which gives us hope as broken people that God can use us. And so the evil is never praised. It's never lifted up as a model, but it is God works with what he has. I don't know a better way to say it yet because we're not far enough to see where the tipping point comes.
It
So
seems like their property.
yeah, well, certainly, yeah. There certainly have a lesser role in that way, but there are it's not I try to avoid either extreme, but so in 1 Kings chapter 11. Gail, do you want to read? Or John, either?
First Kings chapter 11.
Yeah. Just
Okay.
the first. Yep, we're going to read verses 1 through 8 to start with.
Okay. King Solomon, however, loved many foreign women besides Pharaoh's daughter, Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites. They were from nations about which the Lord had told the Israelites, "You must not intermarry with them, because they will surely turn your hearts after their gods." Nevertheless, Solomon held fast to them in love. He had
Now
700
stop you there for
wives.
just a second. So
Okay.
do you hear this is not what God wants, but this is what Solomon did.
Yeah.
Keep going.
He had 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines, and his wives led him astray. As Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father had been. He followed Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. So Solomon did evil in the eyes of the Lord. He did not follow the Lord completely, as David his father had done. On a hill east of Jerusalem, Solomon built a high temple for the Shemesh, the detestable god of Moab, and for Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. He did the same for all his foreign wives who burned incense and offered sacrifice to their gods. The Lord became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. Although he had forbidden Solomon to follow other gods, Solomon did not keep the Lord's command. So the Lord said to Solomon, since this is your attitude, and you have not kept my covenant and my decrees which I commanded you, I will most certainly tear the kingdom away from you and give it to one of your subordinates. Nevertheless, for the sake of David your father, I will not do it during your lifetime. I will tear it out of the hand of your son. Yet I will not tear the whole kingdom from him, but will give him one tribe for the sake of David, my servant, and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen.
We tend not to get this story very well known, but here you get a sense of the it's not good, right? And Solomon, where's the verse? Verse 6, my translation says Solomon did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and did not completely follow the Lord as his father David had done. Well, wait a minute, we just got through reading David. He was no paragon of virtue, right? But what didn't David do? David didn't worship other gods. And so that becomes the central. And David brought the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. And David, despite all his faults, and he had many, worshiped one God in one place, Jerusalem. Solomon starts out okay, but drifts. And what's he going to lose? He's going to lose all but a tribe, right? It's going to get tore out of his hands. And so what we encounter here is the narrative of somebody who, like David before him, David does some wonderful things, and then all of a sudden falls off the edge and it starts to unravel. The same thing is going to now be happening with Solomon. And so you'll read about adversaries in the rest of the chapter. You'll read about Jeroboam, who's one of the kind of the forced labor supervisors who revolts. And finally, it's at chapter 11, it brings us to the death of Solomon. And in the very closing verses, Gail, if your microphone's still on, read 41 through 43.
Okay. As for the other events of Solomon's reign, all he did and the wisdom he displayed, are they not written in the book of Annuals of Solomon? Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel for 40 years. Then he rested with his ancestors and was buried in the city of David, his father. And Rehoboam, his son, succeeded him as king.
So there's other books that we don't have, and the Bible will reference many of those writings that we don't necessarily have. And you can imagine the joy and elation of any archaeologist who happens to dig someplace and come up with some of these other writings that are referred to. But we get to the end of chapter 11, and Solomon has died. And his son Rehoboam is going to be the next king. John, are you willing to read starting in chapter 12 of 1 Kings? You got Rehoboam and Jeroboam. Yes, no? Yes, no?
You said John?
Yeah, well, that's all right. Go ahead.
Oh, Rehoboam went to Shechem, for all Israel had come to Shechem to make him king. When Jeroboam, son of Nebat, heard of it, for he was still in Egypt, where he had fled from King Solomon, then Jeroboam returned from Egypt. And they sent and called him and Jeroboam, and all the assembly of Israel came and said to Rehoboam, your father made our yoke heavy. Now therefore lighten the hard service of your father and his heavy yoke that he placed on us, and we will serve you. He said to them, go away for 3 days, then come again to me. So the people went away.
So I'll stop you there, right? So what tribe is David from? Judah. What tribe is Solomon from? Judah. What tribe is Rehoboam from? Judah. Okay, they're all from this tribe. Israel gets referred to as all the other tribes. And so he goes to Shechem. That's up here, right above this little sword here. And people want a little information before they cast their votes. What information do they want, or what request do they have? It's in verse 4.
Lighten the load.
Lighten the load, right? Your father, Solomon, made our burden heavy. Lighten the load, and we will serve you. Got that? Okay, keep going, Mike.
Then King Rehoboam took counsel with the older men who had attended his father Solomon while he was still alive, saying, how do you advise me to answer this people? They answered him, if you will be a servant to this people today and serve them and speak good words to them when you answer them, then they will be your servants forever.
Okay, so he gets some advice. From whom? The elders, right? The ones who advised his father. Their advice is lighten the load.
Lower tax rate.
Lower taxes, right? And it's pretty interesting. It says, if you will be a servant to them, they will serve you. Keep going, Mike.
But he disregarded the advice that older men gave him and consulted with the young men who had grown up with him and now attended him. He said to them, what do you advise that we answer this people who have said to me, lighten the yoke that your father put on us? The young men who had grown up with him said to him, thus you should say this to the people who spoke to you. Your father made our yoke heavy, but you must lighten it for us. Thus you should say to them, my little finger is thicker than my father's loins. Now, whereas my father laid on you a heavy yoke, I will add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions.
So he gets a different piece of advice from whom?
Young men. Yeah.
His golfing buddies, right? Or whatever it would be in Bible times, right? And he says, hey, they want me to make life easier. Their answer? Yeah. And maybe it's partly just where I grew up, but this is street talk here. When he says, you tell them this, my little finger is thicker than my father's loins. I mean, okay. This is some bravado and machismo and everything else, right? My father whipped you with whips. I'm gonna whip you with scorpions, right? You guys are a bunch of wimps. You're whining, you're complaining. You don't know what hard work is. You thought you had it hard under my father? I'll show you what hard is. And what happens? Mike, keep going.
So Jeroboam and all the people came to Rehoboam the third day, and as the king had said, come to me again the third day. The king answered the people harshly. He disregarded the advice that the older men had given him and spoke to them according to the advice of the young men. My father made your yoke heavy, but I will add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions. So the king did not listen to the people because it was his turn. It was a turn of affairs brought about by the Lord that he might fulfill his word, which the Lord had spoken by Ahijah the Shilonite to Jeroboam the son of Nebat. When all Israel saw that the king would not listen to them, the people answered the king, "What share do we have in David? We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. To your tents, O Israel, look now to your own house, O David." So Israel went away to their tents, but Rehoboam reigned over the Israelites who were living in the towns of Judah. When King Rehoboam sent Adoram, who was a taskmaster over the forced labor, all Israel stoned him to death. King Rehoboam then hurriedly mounted his chariot to flee Jerusalem. So Israel had been in rebellion against the house of David to this day.
Okay. We'd use the word riot. I mean, this is not a happy scene. And you see this kind of rip here between the kingdoms and the sword jagged through. No sooner has Solomon died than that united kingdom gets torn apart. And it is never reunited. Now it's interesting because I emphasize that thing in verse 7 of chapter 12, where it says, "If you will be a servant to this people and serve them and speak good words to them, they will serve you." Turn in your New Testaments to Mark chapter 10.
Not that easy.
Verse 35 and following. Your headline probably tells you that this is where James and John come up to Jesus and say, "Hey, when you die, can we have the two best seats?" Right? Jesus responds. Lori, you want to read? Starting at verse 41?
No, thank you.
No, thank you. Okay. John Olson, you want to read? Mark
Sure.
10:41?
Okay. When the 10 heard this, they began to be angry with James and John. So Jesus called them and said to them, "You know that among the Gentiles, those whom they recognize as their rulers lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them. But it is not so among you, but whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you must be slave of all. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many."
So I want you to hang on to this because we're going to get there eventually. But here's an extremely stark contrast, right? And by the way, it's not just the Gentiles who lord it over their people. We're hearing about some of this as we read through this narrative about the kings, right? And what does Jesus say? This is not my way. I didn't come to be served. I came to serve. And so the contrast is, as we'll see when we get to Jesus, he is often pictured with a crown because he is king, on his knees because he's the king who came to serve. And contrast that to what we're encountering now. So just hang on to it. It's not enough water to slake all your thirst. It's not going to get rid of all of the tough questions that we have and that we're wrestling with, narratives that we find unpleasant, but it's where we're headed. And so I want you to see that. So let me break this picture apart. So here again is the temple outline. And this will play more and more as we go forward. And even though this is not the temple that is in existence in Jesus' day, this pattern is still the same. And what will be different is you'll see there will be a court around the outside of the building where the men could go. There will be another court outside of that area where the women could go. And there will be another area outside of that into which the Gentiles can go. But we're not there yet. Okay. So we have Solomon who builds with forced labor of one kind or another. We have Solomon who has many foreign wives. And while there isn't much comment about these foreign wives, the big deal is they lead his heart astray and he worships their gods. And this united, see it all yellow here, will get divided. And when Jeroboam, this is the Jeroboam we were just reading about, becomes the king of the north, he sets up two worship places, one in Bethel, here in the south, and one in Dan, up here in the north. The writer of Kings will make it sound like they are nothing more than false, idolatrous worship shrines. And they may have been that. But because the narrative is clearly written by someone who favors David and the southern kingdom's views, it's also possible that these shrines were set up as rival centers to worship God, which the writer of Kings hates. And so we don't really know for sure. But Jeroboam sets up, and these temples, if you got a chance to read through the narrative, you'll keep hearing him say, but they followed in the sin of Jeroboam of Nebat, who caused the people to worship at Bethel or Dan, because the only valid place to worship in the eyes of the writer and the kings is Jerusalem. And that will get repeated over and over and over. And so that's sort of what unfolds with Solomon's reign. And so we come to this picture, which is on pages 94 and 95. And let me again break this picture down a little bit, because it can be very complicated until you start to become familiar with some more of the pieces. And let me take our pictures and move them off to the side a little more here. So if you were to count these colored squares, there would be 12 of them. Because when we came out of the wilderness into the promised land, there were the 12 tribes of Israel, and each tribe was sort of on their own. At the end of Judges, you kind of got the sense that this tribal league, as it's described, was not working well. And so the people wanted a king. And so their first king is Saul from the tribe of Benjamin. And Saul rules over all of Israel. And Israel at that point meant all the tribes. David gets on the rise. He starts only ruling over the tribe of Judah, but then after some time, the northern tribes agree to be ruled by him. He passes the throne to his son Solomon. These three kings are referred to as being part of the united monarchy, one land. But as we just read with Rehoboam, Solomon's son, there's a rip. And so you see the rip going down the center here. And the southern kingdom gets named Judah. And by the way, in New Testament times, Judah is Judea. Okay. And the northern kingdom is called Israel. And the territory that the northern kingdom occupies will be known as Galilee, but it'll also be known as Samaria is also a part of that. That comes a little later in the story, and we'll get there, so don't go there. But there's two lines of kings. There's two nations. We could use the language. And any king who has a check mark by their name is a king who somewhere along the narrative is described as a good king. And so you see a check mark by Solomon, and you think, wait a minute, I thought it just said about how Solomon fell apart. Well, yeah, he was a good king who blew it at the end. But then we have this listing of kings. And you see these daggers with drops of blood? That's representing an assassination. And the different colors over here, you've got green and blue and purple and yellow. And what else do we got down here? Oh, here, we'll go this way. You got green, blue, purple, yellow, purple, green, pink, and you got lots of daggers. They were all assassinated. These are little mini dynasties. Jeroboam, his son Nadab, but then Nadab was eventually killed by Baasha. And then Baasha ruled, killed all these, any male connected to this family clan, wiped them out. And then Baasha became king. When he died, his son Elah became king. Then there was a battle between Zimri and Omri. And I mean, it's just this battle, and it's ugly, messy stuff. We don't have time in our session here to read all that, but if you got a chance to read this, it's like this ping pong effect, right? You got this king in the south, and then while he was king, this king in the north came up. And here are some things that happen, and depending on who lived longer, it just sort of goes back and forth between those kings. And so you have this succession of kings until finally in 721, the Assyrian Empire comes in and overruns the northern kingdom and sends them off into exile. And they never come back in any particular united form that we hear about. And to finish a little bit of the story, the people that they left the poorest of the people behind, and they brought peoples from other areas to come live there. And the intermarriage between those two people produced the people known as the Samaritans. And the Samaritans, that group of people didn't know how to worship God, so they sent a couple of the priests back who taught them how to worship God. But then you have the Samaritans who worship God, but they don't worship God on Mount Zion, which is Jerusalem. They worship God on Mount Gerizim. And when we get to Jesus and the woman at the well, we'll have a conversation between this Jew who worships in Jerusalem and the Samaritan woman who says, but our people say we should worship here. So just kind of a heads of what's going. But that's what's happening there. In the southern kingdom, it's all yellow, all descendants of David, except this one little exception right here. And she's completely in quote, or parentheses, Athaliah. This is actually the queen. And she was the wife of Ahaziah, who got killed, and she took over the throne for a few years before one of her children were eventually put onto the throne. So let me go back up to the whole picture here for a minute. So this is the picture as a whole. And so you have the southern kingdom with all these different kings. They continue until the Babylonian exile happens. And I think we will pick up on that because we're going to hear about the prophets in our next unit. But the northern kingdom lasts only for a while, about 200 years compared to the 400, 300 some years here. Okay. Any king with a check mark is a good king. Any king with an X is a king who got assassinated. But as soon as the king was assassinated, they put another descendant of David on the throne. So there's dynastic continuity in the southern kingdom. So we cover a lot of turf in that realm. But we do have one other king to focus in on. Hezekiah here at 715 and Josiah here at 640 are declared to be two of the greatest kings they ever had. Let's spend a little bit of time to find out why. Now we're going to go to 2 Kings. And let's go to 2 Kings chapter, where are we at? 18? 18. Well, we'll have a little fun with 17. So go to 2 Kings 17. I think we got time to do that too. I'll make this guy. So you see Hoshea here. He is the last of the kings in the north. We meet him in chapter 17. And do you see how it says in chapter 17, in the 12th year of King Ahaz or Ahaz of Judah, Hoshea, son of Elah, began to reign? Yes? So you look over here, Ahaz or Ahaz is from 735 to 715. So he's been king for a few years, and then this guy becomes king. So that's how these things kind of go back and forth. And how is he described? He reigned 9 years. He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, but not like the kings of Israel who were before him. So he's still bad, but he's not super bad. Does anybody know who the super bad king in the north was? Ahab. And who does he marry? Jezebel. And they are the worst. And this daughter here, Athaliah, who becomes queen mother in the south, is a daughter of Ahab and Jezebel. That's where there's a little line connecting them. Okay. And by the way, it's Ahab who is the king during the prophet time of Elijah. But because we're cruising at 20,000 feet, we don't have a lot, we don't get to spend time with some of those more details there, right? So Hoshea, the last of the kings in the north, is a bad king, but he's not as bad as the others that are there. And so somebody just read the first 4 verses of 1 Kings 17.
Read back to me.
Sure.
In the 12th year of King Ahaz of Judah, Hosea, son of Elah, began to reign in Samaria over Israel. He reigned 9 years. He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, yet not like the kings of Israel who were before him. King Shalmaneser of Assyria came up against him. Hosea became his vassal and paid him tribute. But the king of Assyria found treachery in Hosea, for he had sent messengers to King So of Egypt and offered no tribute to the king of Assyria, as he had done year by year. Therefore, the king of Assyria confined him and imprisoned him.
Okay. So he agreed to serve the king of Assyria, but apparently was checking out his options down in Egypt. Got caught, was in prison. Keep going.
Then the king of Assyria invaded all the land and came to Samaria. For 3 years he besieged it. In the 9th year of Hosea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria. He carried the Israelites away to Assyria. He placed them in Halah, on the harbor, the river Gozan, and in the cities of the Medes. This occurred because the people of Israel had sinned against the Lord their God, who had brought them up from the land of Egypt, from under the hand of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. They had worshipped other gods and walked in the customs of the nations whom the God drove out before the people of Israel, and in the customs that the kings of Israel had introduced. The people of Israel secretly did things that were not right against the Lord their God. They built for themselves high places at all their towns, from watchtower to fortified cities. They set up for themselves pillars and sacred poles on every high hill and under every green tree. There they made offerings on all the high places, as the nations did, whom the Lord carried away before them. They did wicked things, provoking the Lord to anger. They served idols, of which the Lord had said to them, "Thou shalt not do this." Yet the Lord warned Israel and Judah by every prophet and every seer, saying, "Turn from your evil ways and keep my commandments and my statutes, in accordance with all the law I have commanded your ancestors, and that I have sent to you by my servants the prophets." They would not listen, but they were stubborn, as their ancestors had been, who did not believe in the Lord their God. They despised his statutes and his covenant that he had made with their ancestors, and the warnings that he gave them. They went after false idols and became false. They followed the nations that were around them, concerning whom the Lord had commanded them that they should not do, as they did. They rejected all the commandments of the Lord their God, and made for themselves cast images of two calves. They made a sacred pole, worshipped all the hosts of heaven, and served Baal. They made their sons and daughters pass through fire. They used divination and augury, and they sold themselves to do evil in the sight of the Lord, provoking him to anger. Therefore the Lord was very angry with Israel and removed them out of his sight. None was left but the tribe of Judah alone.
Okay, so if you were to stop there, you'd think, well, at least the people of Judah were good, and just with your eyes, read the next verse. Verse 19, how did Judah fare? Yeah. It's not good. In fact, many Bible scholars believe that it appears that about 90% of the people worshiped other gods about 90% of the time. And so we come to the end of the southern kingdom, and the last little section of chapter 17, which we won't read, talks about how they were settled there. Samaria had been their capital. You want to guess which northern king moved the capital to Samaria? Ahab, yeah. And we're also told, if you got a chance to read that narrative, that Ahab was the one who went ahead and resettled Jericho. It was under his rule that somebody did that. So it wasn't Ahab himself who did it, but somebody under his rule got permission to do that. So I mean, it's bad. But anyway, Hezekiah, chapter 18. Go ahead, Al.
Just first one.
No, go ahead and read through 8 for right now.
In the 3rd year of Hoshea, son of Elah, king of Israel, Hezekiah, son of Ahaz, king of Judah, began to reign. He was 25 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 29 years. His mother's name was Abijah, daughter of Zechariah. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, just as his father David had done.
Okay. Good king, bad king. Good king. Let's hear why.
He removed the high places, smashed the sacred stones, and cut down the Asherah poles. He broke into pieces the bronze snake Moses had made, for up to that time the Israelites had been burning incense to it. It was called Nehushtan. Hezekiah trusted in the Lord, the God of Israel. There was no one like him among all the kings of Judah, either before him or after him. He held fast to the Lord and did not cease to follow him. He kept the commands the Lord had given Moses, and the Lord was with him. He was successful in whatever he undertook. He rebelled against the king of Assyria and did not serve him. From watchtower to fortified city, he defeated the Philistines as far as Gaza and its territory.
Okay. By the way, that Gaza, that's Gaza. Okay, so it's still, some of these places are still under siege, right? What did Hezekiah do? He attacked every other worship anything, including that bronze serpent that Moses had raised up in the wilderness. Well, we're going to hear about how the king of Assyria, Sennacherib, attacks, and Hezekiah reaches out for help to God. In chapter 19, Isaiah, that's the Isaiah that we have in our Bible, the prophet, that we'll get a chance to look at a little bit. So he's alive and working during Hezekiah's time. And one of the things that it's hard to do, but as soon as there come kings on the scene, there come prophets on the scene. And so, like I say, our next unit's going to be looking at those prophets, but we haven't been talking much about the prophets as we go along. But it is Hezekiah who is who's consulting. So somebody, go ahead, Holly, pick up. Now we're jumping to chapter 19. And this is after the Syrian king has made these threats to him. Let's see here. Oh, we got to do this. Start in verse 28 of chapter 18. The Rabshakeh, that's the name of a Syrian official.
Chapter 18.
18:28, yeah.
Then the commander stood and called out in Hebrew, "Hear the word of the great king, the king of Assyria. This is what the king says. Do not let Hezekiah deceive you. He cannot deliver you from my hand. Do not let Hezekiah persuade you to trust in the Lord when he says, the Lord will surely deliver us. This city will not be given into the hand of the king of Assyria. Do not listen to Hezekiah. This is what the king of Assyria says. Make peace with me and come out to me. Then every one of you will eat from his own vine and fig tree and drink water from his own cistern until I come and take you to a land like your own, a land of grain and new wine, a land of bread and vineyards, a land of olive trees and honey. Choose life and not death."
Sound familiar? Right? And this is some of the language. And notice the contrast here, right? My version says, "Thus says the king of Assyria." Of course, we're used to hearing, "Thus says the Lord," right? So it's this stark contrast. Keep going.
Do not listen to Hezekiah, for he is misleading you when he says, the Lord will deliver us. Has the God of any nation ever delivered his land from the hand of the king of Assyria? Where are the gods of Hamath and Arpad? Where are the gods of Sepharvaim, Hena, and Iva? Have they rescued Samaria from my hand? Who of all the gods of these countries has been able to save his land from me? How then can the Lord deliver Jerusalem from my hand? But the people remained silent and said nothing in reply, because the king had commanded, do not answer him. Then Eliakim, son of Hilkiah, the palace administrator, Shebna the secretary, and Joah, son of Asaph the recorder, went to Hezekiah with their clothes torn and told him what the field commander had said.
Okay. Mary, pick up from there.
When King Hezekiah heard this, he tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and went into the temple of the Lord. He sent Eliakim, the palace administrator, Shebna, the secretary, and the leading priests, all wearing sackcloth, to the prophet Isaiah, son of Amos. They told him, "This is what Hezekiah says. This day is a day of distress and rebuke and disgrace, as when children come to the point of birth and there is no strength to deliver them. It may be that the Lord your God will hear all the words of the field commander, whom his master, the king of Assyria, has sent to ridicule the living God, and that he will rebuke him from the words the Lord your God has heard. Therefore, pray for a remnant that still survives." When King Hezekiah's officials came to Isaiah, Isaiah said to them, "Tell your master, this is what the Lord says. Do not be afraid of what you have heard. Those words with which the underlings of the king of Assyria have blasphemed me. Listen, I am going to put such a spirit in him that when he hears a certain report, he will return to his own country, and there I will have him cut down with the sword." When the field commander heard that the king of Assyria had left Lachish, he withdrew and found the king fighting against Libnah. Now Sennacherib received a report that Turkara, the Cushite king of Egypt, was marching out to fight against him. So he again sent messengers to Hezekiah with this word. "Say to Hezekiah, king of Judah, do not let the God you depend on deceive you when he says, Jerusalem will not be handed over to the king of Assyria. Surely you have heard what the kings of Assyria have done to all the countries, destroying them completely. And will you be delivered? Did the gods of the nations that were destroyed by my forefathers deliver them? The gods of Gozan, Haran, Zebeth, and the people of Eden who were in Tel Assar? Where is the king of Hamath, the king of Arpad, the king in the city of Seraphim, or of Hena and Iva? Hezekiah received the letter from the messengers and read it. Then he went up to the temple of the Lord and spread it out before the Lord. And Hezekiah prayed to the Lord, O Lord, God of Israel, enthroned between the cherubim, you alone are God over all the kingdoms of the earth. You have made heaven and earth. Give me ear, O Lord, and hear. Open my eyes, O Lord, and see. Listen to the words Sennacherib has sent to insult the living God. It is true, O Lord, that the Assyrian kings have laid waste these nations and their lands. They have thrown their gods into the fire and destroyed them. For they were not gods, but only wood and stone, fashioned by man's hands. Now, O Lord our God, deliver us from his hand, so that all kingdoms on earth may know that you alone are Lord our God.
And so Hezekiah is in this great distress. He reaches out in prayer to God, and God will answer that prayer. If you go to the end of chapter 19, you'll hear about the destruction and then about how the king goes back to his land and is killed. Chapter 20, Hezekiah becomes sick. Isaiah comes to him and says, you know, your time's up. He says, but, you know, I've been such a good king. Has God forgotten what kind of a king I've been? And anyway, he gets healed. But then in chapter 20, verse 12, they get visitors from Babylon. Hezekiah welcomes them. In verse 13, for example, he says he shows them all the treasures that he has. And Isaiah comes and says, where do these people come from? He said they've come from Babylon. Verse 15, he says, what have they seen in your house? He says, I've seen everything in my house. And then read what Isaiah says, John 16.
And Isaiah says to Hezekiah, hear the word of the Lord. The time will surely come when everything in your palace and all that your fathers have stored up until this day will be carried off to Babylon. Nothing will be left, says the Lord, and some of your descendants, your own flesh and blood, that will be born to you, will be taken away, and they will become eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon. The word of the Lord you have spoken is good, Hezekiah replied, for he thought, will there not be peace and security in my lifetime?
And then, no, and then, you know, it's like, well, wait a minute. That's not a good word at all. But he says, it's not bad for me. Right? Go ahead and finish.
As for the other events of Hezekiah's reign, all his achievements and how he made the pool and the tunnel by which he brought water into the city, are they not written in the books of the annals of the kings of Judah? Hezekiah rested with his fathers, and Manasseh his son succeeded him as king.
So that little reference to the pool and the tunnel and the conduit, I've not been. Anybody been to Israel? So they still take people through that conduit still today. I mean, it's an architectural wonder. And it gets a side note here because it doesn't necessarily tie in with what the author is writing about. So Hezekiah is one of the good kings. Then his son is terrible. His son is Manasseh. And it's going to be because of what Manasseh does, that it's almost like the fate is sealed. And you see, he's here. Here's Hezekiah. Here's Manasseh. His son Amon will get put on the throne. He'll be executed by the people. And then Josiah takes the throne. He is young when he rules. Let's jump to chapter 22. John, keep going.
Josiah was 8 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 31 years. His mother's name was Jedidah, daughter of Adiah. She was from Bozkath. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord and walked in all the ways of his father David, not turning aside to the right or to the left.
All right, so good king, bad king. Good king. What are we gonna hear about him? Sigrid, starting at verse 3.
In the 18th year of his reign, King Josiah sent the secretary Shaphan, son of Azaliah, the son of Meshullam, to the temple of the Lord. He said, "Go up to Hilkiah, the high priest, and have him get ready the money that has been brought into the temple of the Lord, which the doorkeepers have collected from the people. Have them entrusted to the men appointed to supervise the work on the temple, and have these men pay the workers who repair the temple of the Lord, the carpenters, the builders, and the masons. Also have them purchase timber and dress stone to repair the temple. But they need not account for the money entrusted to them, because they are acting faithfully."
Okay, so what is the money gonna be used for?
The temple.
Fixing up the temple. Keep going.
Hilkiah the high priest said to Shaphan the secretary, "I have found the book of the law in the temple of the Lord." He gave it to Shaphan, who read it. Then Shaphan the secretary went to the king and reported to him, "Your officials have paid out the money that was in the temple of the Lord and have entrusted it to the workers and supervisors at the temple." Then Shaphan the secretary informed the king, "Hilkiah the priest has given me a book." And Shaphan read from it in the presence of the king. When the king heard the words of the book of the law, he tore his robes. He gave these orders to Hilkiah the priest, Ahikam son of Shaphan, Akbor son of Micaiah, Shaphan the secretary, and Isaiah the king's attendant. "Go and inquire of the Lord for me and for the people and for all Judah about what is written in this book that has been found. Great is the Lord's anger that burns against us, because our fathers have not obeyed the words of this book. They have not acted in accordance with all that is written there concerning us." Hilkiah the priest, Ahikam, Akbor, Shaphan, and Hosea went to speak to the prophetess Huldah, who was the wife of Shallum, son of Tikvah, the son of Harkash, keeper of the wardrobe. She lived in Jerusalem in the 2nd district. She said to them, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Tell the man who sent you to me, this is what the Lord says. I'm going to bring disaster on this place and its people, according to everything written in the book the king of Judah has read. Because they have forsaken me and burned incense to other gods and provoked me to anger by all the idols their hands have made, my anger will burn against this place. It will not be quenched. Tell the king of Judah, who sent you to inquire of the Lord, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says concerning the words you heard. Because your heart was responsive and you humbled yourself before the Lord when you heard what I have spoken against this place and its people, that they would become accursed and laid waste. And because you tore your robes and wept in my presence, I have heard you, declares the Lord. Therefore I will gather you to your fathers, and you will be buried in peace. Your eyes will not see all the disaster I'm going to bring on this place." So they took her answer back to the king.
Okay, and notice, by the way, they went to consult a woman prophet and got confirmation. So it's often bad news, but it's not always bad. And so what occurs next? Maybe you got a chance to read it in 2 Kings 23. Josiah does the following. Let me get the picture here. So Josiah hears about this scroll that was found. And the temple, remember, or not remember, be informed if you don't already know this. The temples were not only places where people would come to worship. They were the storehouse. They were the repository. They were the bank. They were the place you stored important and valuable things. And so part of the, and I'm smiling in part because my brain's going down a rabbit hole, but churches become the repository of all the things that people don't want anymore in their houses. And they think maybe the youth would like to have it, right? I mean, so churches historically have become full of all sorts of things. And occasionally you just have to dig through and purge, right? And so something like this is happening in the temple, and they find this scroll, this book of the law of the Lord. And the Bible doesn't tell us what that book was. Many Bible scholars speculate that it was the book of Deuteronomy. So later on, if you get a chance to spend some time in Deuteronomy, you're going to read about all the warnings about doing all the horrible things that we've been reading about in Samuel and Kings. And so who knows for sure, but Josiah is informed about this book. He thinks we're in deep trouble if this book is right. They send to Huldah the prophetess, and she confirms that yes, indeed, that book is correct and destruction is coming. But because you've turned and your heart to the Lord, the destruction won't come in your lifetime. And Josiah then, and you see it off to the side here, will go all across both the southern kingdom, which he reigns over in Judah, the northern kingdom, which has been destroyed by the Assyrians, and he gathers up any remnants and vestiges of not only false gods who were worshipped and idols, and they're burned, and so you kind of see all these things being burned, but any place that anybody else worshiped besides Jerusalem gets shut down. And the the position taken by the author of these materials, and a position that I've come to agree with, is that that's why he's such a great kid. It's that one God in one place, and in one place being the important. It's not the one God, but it's only one place to worship God, Jerusalem. And Josiah is the one who burns things. How many of you know Psalm 121, which begins, I lift up my eyes to the hills, from where will my help come? My help comes from the Lord who made heaven and earth, right? He will not let your foot be moved. He will not slumber. The Lord who watches over you will neither slumber nor sleep, right? I mean, it's a wonderful psalm, but I lift up my eyes to the hills. The hills are the places where these other worship sites would be. And so there's an edge to the psalm that we don't always catch. I lift up my eyes to the hills and I see all these places where people worship. Where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord, right? So there's that psalm is grabbing a hold of this. And so Josiah will be the king under which worship is the most centralized. And that's why the title at page 97 at the top is One God in One Place. The next way that this picture expands shows all these places down in Judah that get destroyed. And the stones would represent places where people would worship the Lord, but it wasn't Jerusalem. And then the little calves would be places where people worshiped other gods. And it's not just in these 5 spots, but these are to be representative. And so some of the worship sites were legitimate in terms of the God that they were worshiping, but they were not legitimate because they weren't in Jerusalem. Same thing at the top, you have similar things, including those altars at Bethel and Dan, but other places as well. And so Josiah is the one who kind of wipes out any other spot to worship God. And then, interestingly enough, the Egyptians march north to fight and sort of help the Assyrians. That's when Josiah comes out to stop the Egyptians, because he doesn't want the Assyrians he wants the Assyrians to fall, and he's killed in that encounter in 609 BC. And that takes us then from having one king with Solomon to eventually having two kingdoms, which are parallel to the end of both the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, although we're deferring the southern kingdom till we get done with the prophets, which we'll pick up on next time. And that's way too quick, believe it or not, of a summary of a lot of material. But it gives you at least an idea of this picture in particular of what happens politically, if you will, with the people going from this tribal league to a united monarchy to a divided two kingdoms. One kingdom comes to an end in 721. We'll soon read how the second kingdom comes to an end in 597, but later we'll hear how they come back from exile and how that exile affects them. But before we get to them, we get to the prophets. And we'll take some time to pray. I'll hang around. I'll review the timeline if you'd like to see that, but I know we're at our 2-hour mark here. So let's jump in and pray. Lord, make us instruments of your peace. Where there is hatred, let us sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is discord, union. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. O divine Master, grant that we may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, as to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive, it is in pardoning that we are pardoned, and it is in dying that we are born to eternal life. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as in heaven. Give us today our daily bread. Forgive us our sins as we forgive those who sin against us. Save us from the time of trial and deliver us from evil. For the kingdom, the power, and the glory are yours, now and forever. Amen. It's after a section of the Bible like this that this prayer from Jesus has extra depth for me, right? Asking for God's kingdom, for God's will, for God's name to be hallowed, for God to forgive us, right? For God to save us, to rescue us. This is where our hope lies. So I will cancel the recording for now, but hang around if there are questions.
It's difficult reading